Routers. We probably already know what routers do. We've talked around them long enough. Now it's time to actually just get them into the network. And so network routers connect networks together. We should already know that. They connect networks together. And in this case, they're connecting my internal network to my external network. My internal network being my local area network inside the building of Acme, and the outside network being the one in the outside world. And so that's what the router's job is, to connect those two networks together. Routers route packets to their final destination. We get that. And they're only interested really in the IP address. It forwards packets based on the IP address, which means that a router is by function a layer 3 device. Now, let's talk for a minute about this outside world and who we're getting this outside service from. These are services that are provided by a carrier companies, or it might be someone called an ISP, Internet Service Provider. An ISP is really sort of a subcarrier. The ISP is providing you, the end user, connectivity, but they're probably buying connections from the primary carrier company themselves. Now, for small to medium businesses, very small companies, a lot of those kinds of companies may use a connection called a DSL, or maybe a cable connection. Same kind of connection you might buy at your home. You're just connecting your house network to the internet. You might buy it from, based on who the carrier is, you'll get DSL or cable. Very good for small businesses. But for a larger business, the traditional way to connect a network to the outside world is with something called a T1. And in Europe it's called an E1. And this T1 connection they were primarily used in the earlier days just for voice communications, and you could put multiple voice communications. Literally, it was nothing more than 2 pairs of wires that came into the building, copper wire. And so the T1 connection, they used a technology called TDM, time division multiplexing. And it was a way to sort of slice the time frame up and get multiple voice conversations on the same copper wires. That's the traditional way. Now, as companies began to expand their wide area networks, and they wanted to be able to move data very reliably and very fast over wide area networks, these carrier companies came to us with various options. Frame relay was a very popular one. Now just look at the name, frame. It's talking about packets of data, right? It's moving frames of data around. It's relaying frames from one point to another, frame relay. There was another very popular one called ISDN. There was a slow version and a fast version. There was one called ATM, asynchronous transfer mode. All of these built up ultimately to something called MPLS, multi-protocol something or other. And so MPLS for a long time has been a very popular wide area data connectivity method. It was a way to move packets of data reliably over a long distance. Now, that was primarily in the era of copper. And so for 100 years, people have been burying copper under the streets, under the roads, from building to building, city to city, even country to country, across the oceans even. And so we put a lot of copper out there. Now, in the last decade or so, what we began to do was to put fiber down, because we saw the need for speed. The internet really blossomed out, and the whole .com era created an opportunity for us to really be able to have a need for very high speed wide area networks. And so a lot of fiber has been laid in the ground. And so as a result now, these days, the days where we're living in right now, 2014, it's become very common to be able to bring fiber, not just copper, but fiber right into a building, right into the end user's business. And we now have a product called Metro Ethernet, Metro E, as you'll hear it termed. Metro E now is exactly what it sounds. First of all, you get a very fast, very reliable connection out to the outside world, but you don't get it with some mysterious protocol. What you get is Ethernet. Pretty cool. You get Ethernet either at layer 3 or even at layer 2. And so Metro E is very, very popular these days. Now, I mention all these various types of connections on the WAN side of the router because you have to know that on the LAN side, it's always Ethernet. Always Ethernet, I can trust on what's this side. But on the WAN side of the router, it's going to vary. And so this router happens to be labeled T1E1 right here, which means that I can only plug a T1 in right here. If I'm going to have a network that's MPLS or a frame relay, I've got to configure the router very appropriately. And so what some routers use is a modular system. Whereas the router, I buy the router and then I plug in the module that is particular for that particular connection that I'm going to buy from my carrier. And so for MPLS, I buy the MPLS module. For Metro E, I buy the Metro E router, module, and I plug it into the router, and now I have the appropriate connection for my wide area connectivity. Now, here's just a list of some of those carriers for you. If you're just wondering who those guys are, you'll see immediately here names that you recognize. 2 or 3 for Europe, 2 or 3 for North America, 2 or 3 for Latin America. These are just sort of the big 2 or 3. You'll see some there, like Level 3 and AT&T, that are international. Those are carriers both in Europe and in North America. Just some examples of who those big carriers are. Now, one more thing. I mentioned a minute ago where that fiber optic comes into the building. You don't just plug the fiber directly into your router. There's actually another piece of equipment here that we don't provide. It's provided by the carrier, and we just will call it generically network termination equipment. So the NTE, remember it's from their perspective, so they get to name it. The NTE, network termination equipment, is where their network terminates and where our network begins. And so where those two things connect, it's going to be a little box we'll call an NTE. Now, so you'll know the equipment on their side is NTE. All the equipment on our side, from our router all the way into the network, is referred to as customer premises equipment, right? That word again, CPE. And so you may hear the term CPE sometimes referred to as the equipment that's physically in our building.